Chapter 16. Hiccup seriously begins contemplating his own sanity. Toothless was gone by the time Hiccup finally reached the hilltop, and Jack as well, but that part somehow didn't come as much of a shock. The other dragons were still there, but they were all restless and jumpy. The ground around Hookfang was free of snow, like he'd set himself on fire. Meatleg had found herself a pile of rocks that she was anxiously munching through. Barf and Belch were snapping at each other, which wouldn't have been anything out of the ordinary if they didn't also shoot sharp glances towards the woods, as if they were waiting for an attack. Stormfly trotted up to Hiccup, her hair tilting from side to side like an agitated bird. "Where'd they go, girl?" Hiccup asked, brushing her scales in an attempt to calm her. Stormfly squawked. Hiccup didn't understand her as well as he understood Toothless, but it didn't matter. He already knew the answer. The woods seemed to stare back at him. The darkness seemed almost magnetic, like it was a living entity, luring him inside. Still, now that he'd caught his breath, his previous alarm felt just as ridiculous as it felt on that little island with Astrid. However, that didn't change the fact that it had happened twice, and Hiccup was starting to worry if there actually was something weird going on, or if he was just finally losing it. He didn't know what was worse. Why was it so bad that Jack found the crystal anyway? The worst that could happen was that it turned out to be a stone after all, and maybe he'd get mad or something, which wasn't great, but not bad enough to go haywire about it like Hiccup had just now. Also, he was growing considerably tired of contemplating who was crazy or not. A sudden gust of wind made his body shudder violently. He better go find Jack before he got himself killed. He patted Stormfly goodbye, tried to write off the dragon's apprehension as nothing, and limped back into the forest. He'd gotten about 10 feet when the wind picked up again, so suddenly it sounded like thunder. He yelped, arms flying up to cover his face from snowflakes that felt just a little bit too sharp against his skin to be normal. In the distance, Toothless's plasma blast echoed, followed by a guttural roar. Hiccup set into a run. "Toothless!" he yelled. The ruckus didn't stop. Whatever Toothless was firing at, it wasn't backing down. Hiccup couldn't think of any other reason why Toothless would be out in the forest if not to follow Jack, which meant that if Toothless was in danger, so was he. But that was not counting the possibility that Jack had already stumbled upon whatever it was Toothless was currently fighting, and without any way to protect himself... He halted the train of thought before it could get any further. Questions could come later. The ruckus came to a sudden stop, and Hiccup tried calling out for them again. He kept running, but without any sound to go after, he was afraid he'd never find them. Just when he'd begun to ask himself if he was too late, Toothless roared again, closer this time. The dragon bounded out of the darkness, wobbling from side to side as if he was dizzy and shivering like he was cold. But that was ridiculous. Dragons didn't get cold. "Toothless?" Hiccup called, worry making his voice crack slightly. Then he noticed Jack, and his heart sank even further. For a moment, he thought the worst. Then Jack stirred, shakily pushing himself up. In his right hand, his staff was locked in a weak fist. He tried to say something, but his voice was too broken to discern. Hiccup almost sobbed with relief. He stumbled forward, scanning Jack's body for any wounds that needed immediate attention. Slashes, stabs, burn marks. Who knew what kind of beast they'd encountered? What Hiccup found instead confused him as much as it unsettled him. "Oh, gods," he muttered. He cupped Jack's face, but carefully avoided touching his left cheekbone when he gave a pained whimper. His skin was as cold as ice. Hiccup ran his hands down Jack's shoulders instead, attempting to help him sit up. Jack's eyes fluttered open, but his gaze was on focus. His breath was ragged, and he shuddered like he had a bad fever. It reminded Hiccup of the time he'd almost lost Astrid with the Scourge of Odin, which did not do anything to ease his panic. "Jack, what happened? What's wrong?" Jack's voice was so weak, Hiccup had to lean in closer to hear him. His words made pins and needles run down his spine. "Run, Hiccup. You have to run," he wheezed. "Find the others. Leave the island. Quickly." "Why? What happened to you?" Hiccup asked, but Jack already seemed to be losing consciousness. He tried calling his name, to no avail. Whatever it was Jack tried to say right before his eyes rolled back into his head came out in his native language, and Hiccup was left with nothing but an ominous warning, but an unmistakable order. He wasn't going to waste any time. He climbed onto Toothless, whose shaking was thankfully subsiding, and gathered Jack into his arms the best he could. "Let's go, bud," he told Toothless, who almost took off before Hiccup had finished speaking. Whatever he and Jack had met in the forest, he moved as if it was right on the tip of his tail. Finding the others proved harder than Hiccup thought it would be. He could barely see anything through the snowfall, and the wind kept throwing them off course. If he hadn't known better, he would have thought the weather was deliberately trying to shoot them out of the sky. The only thing they lacked now was some good old lightning. He gathered the dragons and sent them to find their riders. After what felt like an eternity in which Jack showed no signs of waking up, and the only thing reassuring Hiccup that he was still alive was the faint pulsing under his jaw, he spotted Stormfly flying towards them, carrying Astrid on her back. Astrid got the job of gathering the others and cancelling the drill. At first, she was angry about it, but then she took one look at Jack, and she turned pale. Nausea rose in Hiccup's chest at that. Somehow, he'd hoped that Astrid would be able to tell him that this wasn't as bad as it looked. She was always the one to push through pain and injuries, hoping for scars and bragging rights. But there was none of that bravado now. She assured Hiccup she would get the others back to the edge, and ushered Hiccup to fly ahead. It was a long flight, but Hiccup and Toothless wordlessly agreed that it was best for them to head straight for Berk. Goathy was the only one Hiccup could think of that might have an idea of what had attacked Jack in the woods, and more importantly, how to heal him. And there was the possibility that healing was beyond her power, in which case Jack should be as close to home as he possibly could be right now, with Jamie. It was a grim thought, pestering Hiccup no matter how hard he tried not to think about it. For now, he kept a hand on Jack's neck, taking consolation in the faint beat of his heart. As they flew away from the island, the weather gradually cleared up. The wind stopped throwing them around like a paper plane, the temperature rose just a tad, and the snowflakes stopped whipping Hiccup's face. Toothless's course was fast and steady. Hiccup wondered if he hurried because he knew Jack could be in danger, or if he was fleeing from the island. On the horizon, the sky had started to fade into purple, and Hiccup found himself praying for the sun to rise faster. Maybe it would do something about the cold that seemed to have seeped permanently into Jack's body. Not for the first time, Hiccup wished he'd inherited more of his dad's stature. Sharing his body heat with Jack wasn't easy when there was so little body to take from. With shaky fingers, he traced Jack's cheekbone, but quickly retracted his hand when a tingling went through his fingers. In the same moment, there was a sudden flash of color before him. Nothing big, but still big enough for Hiccup to sit up suddenly in alarm. He looked around, but the night had gone back to dark and gray. He could have sworn something green had just appeared by the side of Jack's face, just by his cheekbone. It had been a long night. That's what he told himself. First paranoia, and now he was beginning to hallucinate. Fantastic. "He'll be fine," he muttered, to soothe Toothless's nerves as well as his own. He exhaled shakily and brought Jack close again, wrapping the blanket tighter around him. "This isn't the first blizzard he's survived." A voice in his head told him this blizzard was something very different. He ignored it. "When I read about dragons, none of these pictures looked like these guys." "Don't you come from a place where you don't actually have dragons, though, Jamie?" Jamie pursed his lips. He could go without being reminded of that. "Yeah, but the only thing differentiating a terrible terror from a tiny, like, chihuahua is just the wings. Maybe the scales." The terrible terror, who up until that point had been busy munching on a half-eaten salmon, turned to give Jamie a narrow look. "What's a chihuahua?" Brent asked, seemingly more clueless about the topic than the dragon, somehow. Sorry," Jamie quickly told the terror. "It's a type of dog. They're small, with big eyes, and they act tougher than they look. My neighbor has one. Abby loves her, but the feeling isn't mutual, I think." "Terrible terrors can actually be pretty cuddly, once you're in their trust," Anders said, from where she was sitting opposite of Jamie. To her left, Thrafnildo was sharpening a dagger, seemingly without paying attention to the tetchy dragon in the middle of them. "Oh, I know. We stayed at Goathy at first, remember?" Jamie carefully handed the terror another fish, and quickly retracted his hand when the dragon snatched it. So far so good, but they were quickly running out of salmon. Whose idea was this again? Her terrible terrors were a lot more docile. Bran chewed on the inside of his cheek, watching the half-full basket of fish behind Jamie apprehensively. "Which was why you thought a terrible terror would be a good starting point for training dragons," he said. "Oh, right. It was Jamie's idea." "You are aware that the terrible terror was a part of the dragon-killing training program before we made peace with the dragons, right?" Hildur inquired helpfully. Jamie swallowed. "You don't say," he replied, attempting to sound unaffected. Hildur didn't scare him. That's what he told himself, at least. "They're small, but deadly," Anders added. "They're singing, especially," Hildur muttered. Anders sent her a look. "Don't pretend you don't sleep like a dead person," she argued, before smirking. "You're just mimicking your dad. I've heard him say that exact same thing. Hildur sent Anders a sharp look. Jamie wasn't entirely sure about the idea of riling Hildur up while she held a newly sharpened dagger, but Anders didn't seem to share the same concerns. Brand interrupted before a fight could break out. They're not that dangerous alone, so we don't really have anything to worry about, he said, shooting the soon-to-be empty basket of fish a very much worried glance every so often. Just, do whatever you were planning to do before we ran out of food. Jamie picked up another fish and threw it to the terror. I was kinda hoping it would eat until it got stuffed and then, like dads get after a big feast and they fall asleep by the hearth, Hildur asked. Jamie didn't know much about dads, but he shrugged. Well, maybe you should think of a new plan, Hildur said. It seemed to be breaking the laws of physics, the fact that this dragon could eat the entire basket of fish, which was bigger than he was. Jamie started to regret doing this on the edge of a pier, so far away from anyone who could help if something went wrong. If any of them were set on fire, the idea was to jump into the water, and the smell of fish had been luring the terrible terror down there anyway, so that seemed a good spot initially. Jamie swallowed his anxiety. Maybe see if there's some more fish lying around here, he suggested. Jamie, Brand warned. The terrible terror gave a loud squawk, and Jamie pushed the entire basket over to it. Nice dragon, he muttered. You look lovely, by the way, not at all like a chihuahua. The dragon growled, as if it were saying, That's right, save yourself while you still can. This thing was really nothing like Gothi's terrible terrors. Jamie supposed every dragon had its own personality. This one happened to mirror the personality of a hangry badger. They watched the dragon emptying the basket like a pipe bomb. Run? Brand suggested. Sounds good, Undis said, pulling Hildur to her feet when she didn't immediately follow. They started backing away from the dragon, Jamie inching around it as he was the one sitting at the far end of the pier. He was about to set into a run with the others when something in the sky caught his eye, immediately distracting him. A black dot against the blue. Toothless, he gasped. They're back, Jamie, what are you doing? Brand yelled, halfway up the walkway to the village. How did they get that far so fast? Jamie's eyes snapped down to the dragon when it gave a low growl. The basket was empty, and the terror was now eyeing Jamie as if the difference between salmon and human didn't seem so important at the moment. Jamie quickly backed up, but behind him was only ocean. He started, shakily holding up his hands. No more fish, I'm afraid. And you don't want me? To his surprise, the dragon stopped momentarily, tilting its head as if considering this. 11-year-olds are, not good for your stomach. It will give you indigestion. He tried for a smile. The terror made a sound almost like a purr. Jamie took that as a good sign. Several meters behind it, Brand and the others were watching in a mix of horror and fascination. What's your name? Jamie asked, like he expected the terror to answer. The dragon squawked. Squawk, yeah, good name. Jamie slowly crouched, still holding his hand out. Okay, Squawk. My hand may smell of fish, but promise it's 100% human flesh and bone, so please don't try to take a bite. In the background, Brand shook his head violently. Hilda was watching with wide eyes. Anders was gone, hopefully to get help, or Jamie would be pretty cranky with her later. He inched forward. Squawk blinked his huge yellow eyes. So far, so good. With a shaky inhale, Jamie looked away the way Hiccup had shown him and waited in tense expectation. A part of him expected to live the rest of his life with a few missing fingers, but a bigger part of him hoped to feel Squawk's scales under his palm. In the end, none of that happened. Squawk, squawked and took to the skies. He flew up beyond the piers, over the hill, and disappeared. Jamie tried not to show his disappointment. Then he remembered what he'd seen in the sky, and he grinned at his friends. He ran up to them. Come on, he yelled, sprinting up the wooden ramp. They dashed through the village, Jamie in the lead. His chest was tingling with excitement. He wondered what Jack had found, if he had found anything. To be honest, Jamie didn't really care at the moment. He just missed him, because the almost 4 days he'd been gone seemed a whole lot longer than just 4 days. He expected them to land in the arena where they'd left, but then some villager pointed upwards and said, "There's Hiccup and Toothless." And Jamie looked up to see them soaring, not towards the dragon arena, but towards the chief's house. In other words, Hiccup's house. And they were alone. Where were the other dragon riders? Already then, an uncomfortable feeling started replacing the tingling in Jamie's chest. A crowd quickly formed in front of the haddock house, excited to hear what kind of adventures Hiccup had brought them back to tell them this time. Jamie sped up and ran through it, forgetting about his friends for the moment. Just as he was about to emerge from the crowd, somebody grabbed his wrist. "Jamie!" It was Undis. Her expression was something very different from the one she usually wore. She seemed pale. Her eyes were wide. Jamie pulled his hand back and continued forward. Hiccup was in the middle of explaining something to a dark-haired man when Jamie got to the front. Snotloud's father, Spiteloud, he remembered. Hiccup was standing by Toothless's side, one hand over a bundle on the saddle. A tuft of brown hair emerged from it. "On their own. It was an emergency, so I had to leave before them," Hiccup was saying, sounding agitated. "Astrid is in charge. They'll be fine. Right now I have to get Jack somewhere warm. He's—" That's when he spotted Jamie, and his expression went slack for a moment. Then his brows furrowed, and his mouth became a thin, worried line. It was almost like he was afraid of him, but Jamie knew better. It was the same type of expression that Jack had worn when he told Jamie he'd lost his powers and they'd been thrown back in time. "Jamie?" he started. Jamie wanted to ask where Jack was, but he couldn't find his voice. He walked up to Hiccup, dimly aware that the crowd was parting around him to give him space. He looked at the bundle on Toothless's back, and then at Hiccup again. Hiccup stepped away from Spiteloud to go crouch in front of Jamie instead. "He's fine," he said softly, placing an unsure hand on Jamie's shoulder. "Just a bit hurt. We'll fix him up again." "Hurt?" Jamie repeated. The word felt strange in relation to Jack. "What happened?" Hiccup's expression was pained, but he quickly covered it up. "I'm not sure," he admitted, and got to his feet again. He addressed the crowd. "Give us some space, maybe?" he suggested, though the question was obviously just an order in disguise. The crowd muttered restlessly, but to Jamie's surprise, started to disperse. He only understood why when he saw who was coming towards them, with a gaze so piercing he didn't need to utter an order for the crowd to understand that it was time to leave if they knew what was best for them. "Hiccup," Stoic said, his voice a low grumble. "What is the meaning of this?" "Hi, Dad," Hiccup said absently, unaffected by his menacing presence. Jamie, however, was not, and shuffled closer to Hiccup as he carefully lifted the bundle off Toothless. The blanket fell away, revealing a very unconscious Jack. His limbs hung heavily by his sides, and his head lolled against Hiccup's shoulder. His skin was so pale, it was almost blue. The folds of Jack's cloak by his neck shifted, and Baby Tooth crawled out, looking groggy in a way Jamie had never seen a tooth fairy before. She tweeted, her voice barely reaching Jamie's ears. "What happened?" Jamie asked again. Hiccup and Stoic had been quietly talking. Jamie was vaguely aware of the conversation turning into an argument, but he was too distracted to listen. But when he heard Jamie's voice, Hiccup looked down at him. Jamie saw his shoulders rise as he inhaled, like he was bracing himself. "Come inside, Jamie," he said gently. Jamie glanced over at Stoic, whose gaze was trained on Jack in a way that suggested he wished he was more than just unconscious, but once he noticed Jamie was looking at him, the hard expression faded. He sighed and nodded once. "You go inside," he said. "I'll get Gothy." "Come on, Toothless," Hiccup said, and headed for the door. Jamie hesitantly followed. He glanced back to see that Brand was watching from afar. Anders and Hildur seemed to have departed with the rest of the crowd. Jamie tried for a reassuring smile, but he wasn't sure if he managed it. The haddock house was bigger than any other hut Jamie had been in, but just as warm and welcoming. Aside from the assortment of weapons lying around, but after being on Berk for so long, it didn't really faze him anymore. The only source of light came from candles and the hearth, in which fire crackled softly. Hiccup walked across the room and carefully laid Jack down on a furskin draped on the floor by the fire. Toothless quietly followed, curling up at Jack's feet. Jamie walked closer, watching with a strange detachedness as Hiccup wrapped Jack in his cloak and then the blanket. Hiccup's brows were furrowed in a way that almost made him look angry. It made him look a lot like his dad, and it made Jamie wonder if Stoic really was as angry as he looked all the time, or if he only had a lot on his mind. Babytooth settled on Jamie's shoulder, her hand touching his neck. She didn't say anything, but her presence was comforting. Once Jack was as warm and comfortable as he possibly could be, Hiccup sat back on his knees and sighed. "There," he whispered. His gaze was hesitant as he looked over at Jamie. He looked like he wanted to say something, but in the end he remained quiet. Instead, he nodded at the floor next to him, soundlessly inviting Jamie to sit down. Jamie did, though he didn't quite meet Hiccup's eyes. He studied Jack's pale, expressionless face, halfway covered by the blanket. He wondered when the fear would kick in. It definitely would, he knew that. He'd learned a lot about fear lately, but right now all he felt was... he wasn't sure what it was. Guilt was definitely a part of it. Guilt because he didn't feel as much as he should. "He doesn't look like himself," Jamie said, putting it into words before he even realized he'd figured it out. Jack looked nothing like he should. Not like Jack Frost, not even like Jack Snowland. He just looked like... well, he just looked like a person. A kid, even. Vulnerable and just as lost as Jamie. "No, he doesn't," Hiccup agreed. He turned to Jamie again and smiled sadly. "But he will." Jamie swallowed thickly. He forced himself to look up at Hiccup. "What happened?" he asked for the third time. Hiccup's gaze wavered. I really don't know, Jamie," he said. "Jack wandered off into the woods on his own. We asked him to stay behind, watch over the dragons. I don't know what compelled him to do it." Jamie noted a tinge of annoyance in his voice. He sounded like Jamie's mom sometimes did when Jamie came home past his bedtime. Hiccup was just worried. "Either way, Toothless was with him when I found them again. Or when they found me. Jack was... he was unconscious by that point." Hiccup was definitely avoiding Jamie's gaze now. Baby Tooth chirped, and Jamie frowned. "Was he?" he asked. Hiccup glanced briefly at him before his eyes fluttered back to Jack. "Well, not far off, at least. He was delirious. I mean, he must have been." He shook his head, and when he spoke again, his voice wavered a little. He just told us to run. I don't know what he encountered. I've never seen anything like it." "Like what?" Jamie prompted, his chest tight with apprehension. Hiccup shook his head again. "I don't know," he muttered. "Must be some kind of dragon, native to that island. He has these, He hesitated, glancing at Jamie again. He set his jaw like he was preparing himself for something. He reached over to Jack and gently moved away the blanket covering his face. Jamie let out a shaky breath. He brought a hand up to his shoulder where Baby Tooth was sitting. "It was her," he whispered in English. "Wasn't it?" Baby Tooth placed a hand on one of Jamie's fingers. Her answering chirp didn't tell him much, but Jamie was already convinced. "But then," he started, feeling his lower lip beginning to quiver. "Jamie," Hiccup said, readjusting the blanket again before turning to him. He gave him a serious look. "Jack will be fine. We'll figure out what this dragon was, and Goathy will fix him up. He'll be fine." Jamie's throat ached when he swallowed. He nodded, though that didn't quench all his worries. "Okay," he said. The front door opened. Stoke and Goathy entered, and Hiccup got to his feet. He started recounting the story to Goathy, and Jamie halfway zoned him out as he turned his attention back to Jack. He scooted a little closer. He didn't know how long he stayed there. Jack's dreams were filled with soft voices and cold fingertips tracing his face. Not once did the images stop flickering long enough for Jack to make any sense out of them, but somehow he knew that it was probably better that way. It felt as if his mind was purposefully scrambling itself in an attempt to give itself something that was at least akin to rest. It wasn't until Jack was at the brink of wakefulness that he was brought back to those last moments, clinging on Toothless's back with a searing pain on the side of his face. Then he kept trying to speak to him. In the dream, Jack couldn't make anything out. All he saw was his expression, his lips moving, his green eyes alight with horror. Go. He had to go. He had to get away before it was too late. And then gravity shifted, and something was touching his face again. Jack jolted into action, grabbing whatever it was brushing against his forehead. A strangled shriek followed. "Jack!" Jack's back connected with the wall, and the world came into focus. His hand was closed tightly around someone's wrist. No, not just someone. Hiccup stared back at him, his eyes almost as wide as they had been the last time he'd seen him. Jack's heart pounded. His head was beginning to hammer in protest of moving so quickly. He let go of Hiccup's wrist in favor of bringing his hand to his temple. "Hiccup," he managed. His voice was so hoarse, all that came out was a whisper. Hiccup stared at Jack for a couple of seconds before he stirred into action, reaching for something on the floor beside the bed Jack was resting on. "Here," he said, bringing up a wooden cup. "Water." Jack couldn't bring himself to move. His eyes fluttered around the room as quickly as his heart pounded before they settled on Hiccup again. Where are we?
At my place,
Hiccup said.
He gestured a little awkwardly around himself. This is my room.
Jack's eyes did another sweep of the place. His staff was leaning on the opposite wall. He blinked a few times, trying to gather his thoughts, but it was hard with the sound of his heart beating in the background. Still, he gingerly took the cup from Hiccup. It was surprisingly heavy between his shaky fingers. He took a small sip, and then a bigger one, until he was chugging the glass. He hadn't realized how much his mouth had felt like all of those hot, dry places he never even tried to visit while he was still Jack Frost. By the time the cup was empty, his head pounded just a little less. Hiccup took the cup from him, still with that careful expression.
How do you feel?
He asked. Jack considered it for a moment. Not great, he admitted, but didn't find the strength to elaborate. He could talk about how his body felt like he'd been herding sheep on Antarctica for 3 days straight, or how Hiccup's bedroom was spinning ever so gently around him, or how his heart seemed to be having a boxing match with his headache. But that would require taking up a losing battle against the desert that was now in his throat, and he didn't feel like it. Hiccup's mouth was a thin line, but he managed to smile.
You should probably eat something,
he suggested.
You must be hungry.
Jack frowned. I'm not, he started, but as he said it, he realized that his stomach did feel a little bit too empty. It didn't feel like he was hungry, but it felt as if he probably should be. However, that just presented a more pressing matter. Jack looked down at his hands, as if they held the answer, then around himself again. How did I get here? He asked. Hiccup shifted. His eyes were having trouble choosing between giving Jack a deep, inquisitive look or avoiding any eye contact at all.
I carried you, he replied, suspiciously cautious.
Jack prepared himself for bad news.
Do you remember anything at all?
Jack mouthed the word remember, nausea welling in his chest. When he didn't say anything, Hiccup carefully sat down at the edge of the bed, his brows furrowed. Jack tried searching his expression for answers, but found only that Hiccup wasn't meeting his eyes at all now. He was looking at something slightly below his eyes, at a spot where Jack swore he could still feel cold seeping into his skin. He brought a hand up to it.
You were attacked, Hiccup said. I think you were. I wasn't there, but Toothless.
Mirror, Jack muttered. Do you have a mirror? Hiccup's hesitance only made Jack more desperate to see what was wrong with his face. It didn't feel like a scratch or a scar, but it was cold, and Jack was starting to suspect how it had happened. Hiccup got to his feet and picked up an iron shield from his workbench. As he sat down again, he seemed reluctant to hand it over. Jack took it from him. He peered into its reflection. The image of himself was blurry, but not blurry enough to hide the mark spreading from his left temple down to his cheek. He felt his breath escape him, leaving only something hollow and dark and wrong as he realized what the mark was. A fern-like pattern, like the ones he used to leave on windows and trees and ponds. Eyes etched into his skin like he'd been branded. And then everything came rushing back. Searching the forest, seeing her for the first time, how beautiful she'd been, how happy Jack had been to find her, to know that she was real and maybe he'd finally found a way to go home. Jack wanted to hit himself. How had he been so naive? He knew winter sprites could be mischievous, even malicious, but even so, he'd thought he saw himself in her. And now, everyone had warned him. They said that the Snow Queen was an evil entity that wished to chase the Berkians off their island, bringing the season they'd named Devastating Winter. She hadn't even denied the fact, and Jack had still followed her, still hadn't seen her ulterior motives. If it hadn't been for Toothless, he'd never have gotten away, and he still didn't get away unscathed. And then there was the question of whether he'd really gotten away at all, because he couldn't forget the voice drifting through the snowstorm as Jack rode away in Toothless's back. You will regret coming here, Jack Frost. Wherever the snow falls, I will be there. He told her too much. He recalled the way she'd been muttering to herself, as if contemplating her chances. She was paranoid and territorial. She was the ruler of winter, and she intended to have it stay that way. She'd acknowledged that Jack was special, whatever that meant. She'd tried to kill him. Jack had been so close to dying a second time, and if the Queen spoke the truth, he wasn't safe yet. None of them were. As winter came to Berk, so would she, and she knew he was here, because he told her. Just like that, he'd put the whole village in danger. Jamie, Hiccup,
Astrid, everyone, just because Jack had been too busy projecting on a stranger to see the danger that was right in front of him. Jack snapped his eyes away from the shield as Hiccup gently moved it away. He realized his breath had started to come in short, hollow huffs. Hiccup was watching him warily, his movements slow and gentle as he put the shield down on the floor. "What happened back there?" he asked. "What did that to you?" Jack couldn't answer. He didn't trust his voice, and Hiccup couldn't know the truth anyway. Not just because he wouldn't possibly believe him, but because Jack was ashamed. And he was scared. And he was lost. And there was nobody he could reach out to for help. He was alone with Jamie, to whom he'd already brought enough misery. So much for being the guardian of fun. He started shaking his head. He started, but immediately choked up. He didn't have enough strength to fight it, and used all that he had to keep the waterworks at bay. Still, he was pretty sure the world hadn't been so blurry earlier. He took a shaky breath and closed his eyes, bringing his knees up to his chest. "I'm sorry," he managed. "It's my fault. I shouldn't have gone. I shouldn't have—" "Okay, it's fine," Hiccup interrupted, and Jack felt his hand cover his own. "You don't have to tell me—" He said it as if he hadn't planned for the sentence to stop there. The "right now" or "yet" hung in the air. Jack bit his tongue and forced himself to calm down. It didn't quite work, but he managed to open his eyes at least. The last thing he wanted was Hiccup's pity, even if it seemed he'd already got it. Hiccup didn't know, but it wasn't something Jack deserved. Not after disobeying his orders. Not after sneaking along to the training drill. Not after lying to him, over and over and over. It took a few more seconds until Jack had calmed his breath again and trusted himself to speak without choking up. In the meantime, Hiccup hesitantly retracted his hand, and Jack pretended his own hand didn't feel awfully cold without it. "What happened after I—" Jack gestured vaguely. "Passed out?" Hiccup wrung his hands. You told us to run first," he recounted. "I thought you—" He stopped himself, as if he regretted speaking. He shook his head. I found Astrid and I put her in charge while I flew ahead to get you back here as fast as possible." "And they all got here?" Jack asked. "Safely?" "Yes," Hiccup said, eyeing him. "They're all fine. They arrived about a day after us." Jack blinked. "A day? How long was I out?" Hiccup's gaze wavered again. 4 days, he replied stiffly. 4? Jack started, his voice breaking. He started scrambling out of bed, uttering a series of words that North would have put him on the naughty list for. "Where's Jamie?" he demanded. Then the world tilted violently, and he staggered sideways. Hiccup caught him clumsily, and Jack's head collided with his chin. "Ow, Jack, calm down, please." Jack stopped struggling, if only because whatever he left in his stomach was threatening to come back up. Hiccup managed to guide him back to bed, and Jack shakily sat down on the edge. Hiccup smiled, and for the first time since Jack woke up, it had an ounce of real cheerfulness in it. "He's been bunking over ever since we got back," he said. "Been actively winning my dad over the whole time. He's probably asleep now, though." Jack stared at him. Then he let out a relieved laugh. He ran a hand across his face and nodded. "Of course he would," he murmured. Hiccup was still smiling at him when Jack dropped his hands to his lap. "Yeah, he's hard not to like," he agreed. "I doubt he's even aware of how much he's been aiding your case just by pestering Dad with all his questions. I get a feeling Stoics miss having someone look at him with such wide, awestruck eyes when he tells stories about his adventures." As someone who'd been on the receiving end of that awestruck look multiple times, Jack could only sympathize. He smiled a wobbly smile. "So he's been fine then," he said. "Without me." The gleam in Hiccup's eyes faltered a little. "Well, he's... He pressed his lips together, then sent Jack a serious look. "He's strong, is what he is. He's been doing fine, but he spent a lot of time just sitting here, waiting for you to wake up." Jack lowered his gaze. Barely fine, he decided. He'd been sleeping for 4 days, while Jamie was on his own, not knowing if Jack would ever wake up at all. "You should rest some more," Hiccup said. Jack only shrugged in reply. "It's the middle of the night and you look—" He trailed off, and Jack's mouth quirked upward at the awkward break. It was charming. "There's some leftovers from today's stew if you want," he offered instead. That's all right, Jack quickly said. Don't think I could stomach that right now. Fair enough, Hiccup mumbled, scratching his cheek. They sat in silence for a few seconds until Hiccup got to his feet. I'll leave you to rest then, he said. Dorothy said she'd stop by with soup tomorrow morning, so I'll wake you then. Hiccup paused with his leg one step down the stairs. Yeah? Jack opened and closed his mouth. Whatever had made him say his name, he couldn't remember what it was anymore. Thanks, he said, for... He gestured vaguely, hoping that Hiccup would understand even if Jack didn't even completely understand himself. Hiccup looked at him for a few seconds, probably waiting for an elaboration. When it didn't come, he just smiled. Sleep well, Jack, he said, and turned to take another couple of steps down. Hiccup? Jack said, again making Hiccup pause. He turned around with an arched brow. Jack? Don't leave yet, please? Jack fidgeted with the fur on the blanket, wishing he had his staff. He didn't know what to do with his hands without it. I don't want to be alone. It felt stupid, not to mention selfish and entirely undeserved. But the words were out, and quite easily too. Jack was well versed in those words after all, or any iteration of them. Even if Hiccup was one of the very few who had ever heard him say them out loud, it wasn't something he could bring himself to feel too ashamed of. Hiccup's expression did something weird, where it seemed to soften and stiffen at the same time. Of course, he said, coming up the stairs again. He stopped awkwardly in the middle of the room, shifting his weight from side to side a few times. Do you want me to wait until you fall asleep? Jack thought he might be smiling again. Sure, he said, shifting to make space. Hiccup sat down on the edge, and Jack lay back down on the fur. They remained like that for a bit. It wasn't entirely comfortable. I've stolen your bed again, Jack then noted. Hiccup's lips twitched. Pretty sure an unconscious person can't steal anything, he countered. Jack chuckled. Still, doesn't seem fair. It's not like you asked for some strange boy that might be a troll to occupy your bed space. His smile only widened when he thought he saw Hiccup rolling his eyes. Or what? You're gonna murder your voice again, Hiccup said. Go to sleep. It can't possibly get any worse than this, Jack mumbled. If you don't shut up, it will, Hiccup promised. Then he narrowed his eyes. What are you grinning for? Jack shrugged. Thought you said you'd never tell me to shut up, he said. Told you it would happen. Hiccup turned to him. That doesn't count, he protested. Jack hummed. Don't know about that. It doesn't. It's not like we established any clear-cut rules on the matter. I just said you should preserve your voice. And I said that's just a polite, hiccupy way to tell me to shut up. Hiccup laughed and shook his head. You're impossible. Go to sleep. Jack probably would have continued annoying him if he'd had the energy to. Sadly, he didn't, and just settled for smiling impishly at him. And for once, it felt as if he was going to follow Hiccup's order, whether Jack liked it or not. His lids were already beginning to feel heavy again. Thing was, he knew that if he fell asleep, Hiccup would leave the room, and even if he'd be unconscious by that point, the thought didn't sit well. Besides, Jack was still cold. He could admit as much if he could use it as an excuse to keep Hiccup here. And sure, Jack was still amazed by the thought that he didn't pass through people anymore, but there was something more to it than that. It felt like something had shifted inside him after that night on the edge, and he wondered why it was so different from falling asleep next to Jamie. But it was different, and he found himself craving it. There's room for two, he said, quirking a brow when Hiccup didn't seem to understand him. It was quite straightforward, Jack thought. I mean, if I didn't scare you off last time. Hiccup's mouth was slightly ajar. Then he started to nod. Yeah, I mean, no, you didn't scare me off, he laughed sheepishly, running a hand through his hair. What if I hawk the blanket again, though? Jack shrugged. Colder to sleep alone, anyway. He moved away the blanket so Hiccup could lie down. Good point, Hiccup mumbled. He started moving his hand down towards the metal leg, but caught himself. Instead, he started laying down, and Jack realized something he hadn't even considered before. You usually take it off, he said. Hiccup stopped mid-motion. He looked at Jack, and then his leg, pressing his lips together. Well, yeah, I mean, sometimes, I guess. He wasn't a great actor. Jack nudged him. Take it off, then, he said. I won't kick you out of bed or anything. Promise. That earned him a look that was a mix between annoyance, amusement, and doubt. Really?
Not on purpose, anyway.
That's reassuring.
Jack closed his eyes. He didn't need to be a people expert to realize that Hiccup felt vulnerable without his prosthetic, so he'd give him whatever privacy he needed. Not like Jack actually minded, but that didn't really matter. As he heard Hiccup place the leg on the floor beside the bed before lying down next to him, he silently vowed to reach the point where Hiccup felt totally safe with Jack. How he would do that, Jack didn't know, but it felt important. Jack opened his eyes again. Hiccup was lying halfway on his back, looking up at the ceiling with his lips pressed tightly shut. "You look like a sunset." Hiccup gave him a disturbed look.
"What?"
"Bright red." He gave a quiet groan, accompanied by a roll of his eyes.
"All right," he said, turning over so he was facing Jack. "I can't believe you've been out for 4 days, and then wake up to immediately make fun of me."
Jack yawned. "I make fun of everything. Haven't you noticed?"
"Of course I've noticed. You know I've noticed."
He yawned as well. Jack felt a quiet but powerful pang of affection at the sight, but didn't know what to do with it, so he just lay there smiling like a doofus. Thankfully, Hiccup didn't open his eyes again to see it.
"Sleep now?" he asked.
Jack shifted, attempting to scoot closer unnoticed.
"Yeah,"
he murmured. It didn't take long before he began drifting off to sleep, but still long enough to notice when Hiccup closed the rest of the distance between them to put his arm around him again.